It was a bright Sunday morning in Chicago, the city still waking up as the sun peeked over the horizon, casting a warm glow on the streets. The sounds of bustling cars and distant voices filled the air. But inside St. Mark's Church, all was peaceful. The church was a well-known place of worship in the south side of Chicago, with its tall stone walls and stained glass windows depicting biblical scenes. It was a place where the community gathered every week to pray, to worship, and to listen to the powerful sermons delivered by Pastor Elijah Knight. Pastor Knight had been a respected leader for over a decade, known for his passionate speeches about faith, love, and forgiveness. He had turned many lives around with his teachings, and his presence was a constant source of comfort for his congregation. His deep voice carried across the pews, often making people feel as though God himself was speaking directly to them. But that Sunday would be different. That Sunday, Pastor Knight's voice would be silenced forever. It was during the opening hymn that tragedy struck. As the congregation sang in unison, the doors of the church opened with a creak. All eyes turned to see a woman in a red dress standing in the doorway. She was tall, with long, dark hair and a look of intense determination on her face. Her name was Vanessa Hayes, and she had once been Pastor Knight's lover. Vanessa's eyes scanned the room, locking onto Pastor Knight as he stood at the altar. His back was turned as he prepared for the next part of the service. There was no sign of the conflict that had been brewing for weeks, no sign of the toxic breakup that had torn them apart. But Vanessa wasn't there to worship. She was there for revenge. In one swift motion, she pulled a small black handgun from her purse. The congregation gasped, and before anyone could react, she raised the weapon and fired 3 shots. The sound of the gunshots echoed through the church, a sound that would forever be etched in the memories of those who were present. Pastor Knight collapsed to the ground, blood pooling around him as he lay motionless on the altar. The congregation screamed in horror, and chaos erupted. People scrambled for cover, some ducking behind pews, others rushing to help their fallen pastor. But it was too late. Pastor Knight was dead. Vanessa stood over him, the gun still in her hand, her eyes filled with anger and sadness. She didn't move. She didn't run. She simply stared at the lifeless body of the man she had once loved and now hated. The door to the church was still wide open, and Vanessa slowly turned and walked out, leaving the scene of her crime behind her. Outside, the cold air hit her face as she stepped onto the church steps. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had done what she came to do. But what had driven her to this point? What had made her shoot the man she once adored? As the sirens wailed in the distance, drawing closer, Vanessa knew that her life would never be the same. Detective David Turner arrived at the scene shortly after the paramedics had confirmed Pastor Knight's death. He had been a seasoned investigator with the Chicago Police Department for over 15 years, and he had seen his fair share of tragic events. But something about this one felt different. There was a sense of disbelief hanging in the air, a feeling that this was not just another senseless crime. Turner walked into the church, surveying the scene. Blood stained the altar and the floor beneath it, and the broken silence was filled with murmurs from the shaken witnesses. A few church members were being interviewed by other officers, their faces pale and their voices trembling. Everyone had witnessed the same thing, the woman in red who had shot the pastor in cold blood. It was hard to believe that this was happening in their community, in a place that had always felt safe. Vanessa Hayes was quickly identified as the shooter, and the police were already looking for her. Detective Turner had seen the reports about her, and from what he knew, she had been in a relationship with Pastor Knight for several years before he ended things for good, saying he had found a new purpose in his faith and could no longer continue their romantic involvement. But what Turner couldn't understand was why Vanessa had come back to the church that day. What was so important to her that she would kill the man she once loved in front of an entire congregation? The lead investigator, Detective Sarah Lopez, was already speaking with the witnesses, piecing together their statements. Turner joined her, and they walked toward the altar, where the body of Pastor Knight was still lying. "Looks like a clear case of murder," Lopez said, her voice grim. The woman walked in, shot him, and walked right back out. The witnesses all say the same thing. Turner nodded but didn't seem convinced. "It's too clean. Too easy, he muttered, staring down at the bloodstains. Something doesn't add up. Lopez agreed. Let's start digging into her background. See if we can find anything that explains this. As the two detectives began to gather evidence, they couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a simple case of jealousy or rage. There had to be more to it. There always was. The investigation had only just begun, and already it was becoming clear that the truth behind Pastor Knight's murder was far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. The deeper they dug, the more they would uncover about the tangled web of lies, betrayal, and twisted motivations that had led to this tragic moment. And as the case unfolded, the detectives would soon realize that the answers they sought were far darker than they had ever anticipated. The days following Pastor Knight's murder were filled with a whirlwind of interviews, statements, and investigations. The police had quickly identified Vanessa Hayes as the prime suspect, but Detective Turner had a gut feeling that things weren't as straightforward as they seemed. His years of experience had taught him that the truth often had layers, and the more he looked at the case, the more it became clear that there was more to Vanessa's actions than a simple crime of passion. Vanessa had been taken into custody not long after the shooting. She had been found walking down a nearby street, still in the red dress, her hands trembling, but her face strangely calm. She had not resisted arrest. There was no denying what she had done, and the evidence seemed to point directly at her. But Turner couldn't help but feel a nagging doubt at the back of his mind. When he arrived at the police station that morning, he was greeted by Detective Lopez, who was already poring over the details of Vanessa's background. "We've got her," Lopez said, looking up from the files on her desk. "Vanessa Hayes was a successful businesswoman before she met Pastor Knight. She worked in real estate and was making a good living, but after she started her relationship with Knight, things began to change. She started spending less time on her business and more time at the church." Turner leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. "That's normal, right? People do change when they find religion. It's not unusual for someone to become more dedicated to their faith." Lopez nodded, but there was a hint of skepticism in her voice. "True, but what's odd is how she and Knight's relationship ended. From what I can gather, it wasn't just a breakup. It was more like an abandonment. Knight had begun to focus more on his ministry, and according to the people around him, he started distancing himself from Vanessa. He told her that he had found a higher calling in Christ and that their relationship was no longer a part of his life. This wasn't just about love. He broke it off because he believed he had a mission to fulfill. Turner's eyes narrowed. "So he essentially dumped her for God." "Exactly," Lopez replied. "And from what I can tell, Vanessa didn't take it well. She's been showing signs of instability for months. People at the church said she would show up unannounced, trying to get his attention, even after he had made it clear that he wasn't interested in continuing their relationship. It was like she couldn't accept it. But why kill him? If she was so upset, why not confront him? Why not leave him in peace?" Turner questioned. "It doesn't make sense," Lopez shrugged. "Sometimes people don't handle rejection well. And if she truly believed that Knight had ruined her life, maybe she saw his death as the only way to reclaim the control he took from her." Turner wasn't convinced. Something about Vanessa's demeanor when she was arrested bothered him. She hadn't acted like someone who had just killed the man she loved. There was no panic, no crying, no remorse. Instead, she had walked calmly from the church, almost as if she had done something she felt justified in doing. Turner leaned over the files on Lopez's desk and began reading the notes she had compiled. As he skimmed through them, one detail caught his eye. Vanessa's finances. "Did you know that she was in debt?" "She was having serious financial troubles before the breakup with Knight," Turner said, his voice rising in surprise. "She had borrowed money from several sources, including high-interest loans from private lenders. There were reports of her being under pressure to pay them back." Lopez nodded. "Yeah, I saw that too. She had even taken out a second mortgage on her property in an attempt to cover her debts. It seems like her business had been struggling, and Knight had always been there to help. But after he ended the relationship, she lost that support. Her financial situation only got worse. In the weeks leading up to the shooting, Vanessa had been spending more time with people who were known to have questionable connections, people who might have encouraged her to take more drastic actions. So she was desperate," Turner muttered, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. This is starting to make sense now. It wasn't just about losing a lover. It was about losing everything. Her finances, her status, and perhaps even her future. Knight was her last lifeline, and once he cut her off, she had nothing left to lose. Lopez nodded. That's one theory, but there's still one thing we haven't figured out. Why did she choose to kill him in front of the entire congregation? Why the public spectacle? Turner stood up and began pacing around the office, his mind racing. Maybe it wasn't just about killing him. Maybe it was about making a statement, a public declaration that he was the one who wronged her, shamed her in front of everyone. If she couldn't have him, she wanted the world to know why. And maybe, just maybe, she wanted people to sympathize with her, to see her as the victim in this twisted love story. Lopez looked up at him, her eyes sharp. You're saying this wasn't just a crime of passion, it was calculated. Turner stopped pacing and nodded. Exactly. She knew exactly what she was doing. She planned it all. The public setting, the dramatic entrance, the gunshots. It was all part of the show. And now she's playing the victim. She wants everyone to think she was pushed too far. Just as he finished speaking, a uniformed officer entered the room with new information. Detective Turner, Detective Lopez, we just received an important piece of evidence from the church security footage, the officer said, holding up a tablet. You might want to see this. Turner and Lopez exchanged glances before walking over to the officer. The footage was from the church's security cameras, and it showed Vanessa entering the building. But what was more surprising was what happened after the shooting. As the footage played, Vanessa was seen standing over the pastor's body, staring down at him for a long moment. Then instead of leaving immediately, she stood frozen. It was almost as if she was waiting for something, waiting for someone. Turner watched the screen closely. She's waiting for the reaction, waiting for the shock to set in. She wanted to savor this. Lopez frowned. That's chilling. But as the footage continued, Turner's suspicion grew. Something wasn't right. There was something more to this, something Vanessa had missed. Let's go back and dig deeper, Turner said, his voice firm. I think we're missing something critical. There's more to this story than just a jealous lover and a murder. Lopez agreed. We need to find out what she was really after and why she chose to end it all in such a dramatic way. There's more to uncover here. With that, they set off to continue their investigation, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. What they would find would reveal the dark, twisted motivations behind Pastor Knight's murder and expose secrets no one could have predicted. Detective Turner's instincts were kicking into overdrive. The more he thought about the church surveillance footage, the more certain he became that Vanessa's actions weren't as impulsive as they seemed. She hadn't just been angry. There was something methodical about her behavior after the shooting, something that hinted at deeper motives. Back at the precinct, Turner and Lopez sat down at their desks, reviewing every available piece of evidence again. The small details were beginning to matter more than ever. The more they learned about Vanessa's past, the clearer it became that her life with Pastor Knight had been far from simple. Turner glanced over at Lopez, who was busy going through Vanessa's real estate files. She had spent a lot of time in the world of finance before meeting Pastor Knight, and her business acumen wasn't lost on the detective. This woman had a keen mind for numbers, and that alone made her actions even more suspicious. Lopez, have you noticed anything unusual about Vanessa's finances lately? Turner asked, breaking the silence. I mean, it's clear she was struggling, but it seems like there's something deeper going on, something that ties her financial situation directly to Pastor Knight. Lopez paused, her eyes narrowing as she thought about it. I've been going through her real estate records and bank statements again. She had a lot of assets tied up in properties, but most of them were underwater, meaning she owed more than the properties were worth, and she wasn't just dealing with regular debts. Some of the loans she took out came from unsavory sources. I found records of her borrowing money from people who have a history of running high-interest loan schemes, including people with ties to organized crime. Turner frowned. Organized crime? This just keeps getting messier. So she wasn't just financially desperate. She might have had people pressuring her, too. That could have pushed her to make a drastic decision. Lopez nodded. Exactly. And remember, when Pastor Knight cut ties with her, he essentially cut off any chance she had of escaping that financial mess. She might have seen his rejection as the last straw, the moment everything fell apart. Turner rubbed his chin thoughtfully. I agree, but there's still one thing that doesn't add up. If she was so financially desperate, why would she murder him in such a public way? Why not do it quietly and run? Lopez shrugged. That's what we need to figure out. There's more to her motives than just money or revenge. The two detectives continued poring over Vanessa's background. Lopez continued to dig into her financial dealings, while Turner turned his attention to Vanessa's relationships with the people in the church. He was starting to get the sense that there was something more personal driving her actions. After several hours of intense investigation, Turner came across an interesting lead. One of Pastor Knight's close associates had mentioned that he had been planning to expand the church's ministry in a major way. There were whispers of him starting a large charitable foundation that would benefit the local community, with funding that would come from donations and investments. But there was a catch. Pastor Knight had made it clear that he wanted to remove any ties to Vanessa in his plans. She had been an integral part of his life at one point, but now he viewed her as a distraction, a negative influence on the ministry's future. As Turner continued to read through the notes, he felt a flicker of understanding. Lopez, I think I've got it. It wasn't just about money. Vanessa wasn't just losing Pastor Knight as a partner. She was losing control over something much bigger than her. She was losing her influence on the church, and that influence was what had given her power all along. Lopez looked up, her eyes wide. You mean she didn't just want revenge for being dumped? She wanted to control the church's future too. Turner nodded slowly. Exactly. Pastor Knight wasn't just a man to her. He was the key to everything. His position in the church, the community, the ministry's resources. She saw all of that slipping away. And if she couldn't have it, no one else could either. The more Turner thought about it, the clearer it became that Vanessa's obsession with control had reached its peak. Pastor Knight's rejection had been the final blow to her sense of power, and now in her mind, taking him out was the only way to reclaim that control. Lopez pulled up a list of recent church donations. This just came in. A large sum was donated to the church's expansion fund, but it came with a very specific condition. The donor wanted a say in how the church was run. And the donor's name? She paused dramatically. Vanessa Hayes. Turner's eyes widened. Vanessa was still involved in the church's future in some way. She thought that by taking Knight out, she could take over the ministry and make it her own. Lopez shook her head. She didn't just want the money. She wanted the position, the control. She wanted to replace Knight as the face of the church's future. Turner sat back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. This is bigger than a simple love triangle. This was a power struggle. And Vanessa believed that if she couldn't have Knight, she could at least take everything he had built and make it her own. The pieces were falling into place, but there was still one key piece missing: the moment of the murder. Vanessa had arrived at the church alone that day, walking in confidently, almost as if she knew exactly what she was about to do. Turner knew that they needed to piece together the final moments leading up to Pastor Knight's death. He wanted to understand what Vanessa had been thinking in those crucial seconds. Did she see the gun as a way to reclaim her power? Or was there more to it, something darker, more twisted? The investigation had only just begun. They had the motive. They had the financial struggles, the church politics, and the public spectacle of the murder. But the truth was still out of reach. Turner felt an unsettling feeling in his gut. They were on the right track, but there were still secrets buried deep within Vanessa's past that would need to be uncovered. The pieces of the puzzle were there, but it would take all of Turner's experience to find the missing pieces and unravel the full story. And as he left the precinct for the night, Turner couldn't help but wonder, was Vanessa the mastermind behind this tragic end? Or was she just a pawn in a much bigger game? Only time and the evidence would tell. Detective Turner stood outside the church the next morning, the sun casting a cold, pale light over the building. It was a strange kind of peace, one that contrasted sharply with the violent end that had unfolded inside only a few short days ago. Turner had a feeling that if he walked through the doors of that church again, the truth would feel even closer. He just needed to piece together the final moments of Pastor Knight's life. The morning after the shooting, Turner and Lopez had secured a full forensic report, but there was still one critical part missing: the timeline of what had happened in those final minutes. Pastor Knight's death was shocking, not only because of its brutality, but because of how easily it could have been avoided had Vanessa made different choices. As they stepped inside the church, Turner's eyes scanned the sanctuary, now eerily quiet. The heavy scent of cleaning chemicals still lingered in the air, and the area where the altar stood felt cold and abandoned. It was as if the church itself had lost its sense of purpose, as though something important had been erased from it in an instant. Lopez handed Turner a folder. "I've been going through the surveillance footage again," she said. "I found something interesting. Vanessa entered the church alone, just like we suspected. But here's the strange part. She lingered outside the entrance for a few minutes before coming in, almost like she was preparing for something." Turner raised an eyebrow. "Preparing? For what?" Lopez shrugged. "I don't know, but it's almost as if she was unsure, maybe even second-guessing herself." The footage clearly showed Vanessa pacing outside the entrance, checking her watch several times. She was dressed in a red jacket, her dark hair styled tightly, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement as she waited. There was no one else around. It was as if she had been expecting someone, but when no one arrived, she steeled herself and walked into the church. "I need to speak to Pastor Knight." Vanessa's voice echoed on the footage as she entered the building. The surveillance caught her walking up to the altar, where Pastor Knight stood, preparing for his morning sermon. At first, he didn't seem to recognize her, but when their eyes met, his expression changed, and Turner could see the brief flicker of surprise before he wiped it away with a forced smile. There was an uncomfortable pause as Vanessa and the pastor exchanged a few words. Turner had already seen this on the footage before. Vanessa confronting Pastor Knight in the middle of his sermon. From the looks of it, she was angry. But what the footage didn't show was what had happened next. The gunshot had been fired almost immediately after their conversation, cutting the exchange short. "Turner, I think it's time we go deeper into the church's security system," Lopez said. "Maybe we've missed something important." The two detectives moved into the back office, where the church's security equipment was located. They needed to know exactly what had happened in those moments before the gunshot rang out. Turner leaned forward, scanning the system's interface for anything unusual. He found that the system had been manually disabled for a brief period, just enough time for Vanessa to enter the sanctuary and shoot Pastor Knight without anyone noticing. "That's interesting," Turner murmured. "The cameras were shut off for just 5 minutes. That's all the time Vanessa needed to execute her plan. It's as if she knew exactly when to pull the trigger." Lopez nodded. "But who disabled the cameras? It had to have been someone with access to the system." Turner's mind raced as he thought through the possibilities. Vanessa, of course, she knew how the security system worked, and if she was planning something this bold, she would have made sure she could carry it out undetected. This was premeditated. Lopez began pulling up employee records for the church, searching for anyone who might have access to the security system. As expected, Vanessa's name appeared. She had volunteered at the church for years, overseeing various projects. She had worked closely with Pastor Knight and his staff. She knew every inch of this place, every system, every password. "Lopez, check this out," Turner said, pointing to a log entry. "This shows that Vanessa had logged into the church's system on the day of the murder, just an hour before the shooting. She disabled the cameras and then went outside to wait for her chance to confront Pastor Knight." Lopez's eyes widened. She planned it all out. She knew when he'd be alone, and she knew exactly how to get in without anyone noticing. The more Turner examined the data, the clearer it became that Vanessa's actions weren't as spontaneous as they first seemed. This wasn't a case of a jilted lover lashing out in a moment of rage. This was cold, calculated. Vanessa had been planning this for weeks, maybe even longer. She'd known exactly when to strike and had taken all the necessary precautions to ensure there would be no witnesses. "Turner, we need to look into the relationship between Vanessa and Pastor Knight more closely," Lopez said. "I don't think it's just about the church." "I think it's personal," Turner agreed. There was something deeper at play, something that wasn't immediately obvious. He knew Vanessa had been emotionally tied to Pastor Knight, but it was more than that. This was about power, influence, and control. Vanessa had invested too much of herself in the church's success, and when Pastor Knight started distancing himself from her, she lost the one thing that had given her purpose. Lopez and Turner continued digging through records and testimonies from the church's congregation. They discovered that Vanessa had been deeply involved in the church's outreach programs. She had been a prominent figure in the community, beloved by many of the members. But that power had begun to wane when Pastor Knight began pushing her out of his plans for the future of the church. As Turner put it together, he realized that Vanessa's motivations weren't just emotional. They were practical, too. She had used her influence to build a network of supporters, people who looked up to her and depended on her. Losing her position at the church wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was a threat to everything she had worked for. And now it seemed, Vanessa had decided that if she couldn't control the church's future, no one else would. Turner turned to Lopez with a grim expression. "I think we're looking at more than just a lover's quarrel gone wrong." This was a power play. Vanessa believed that without Pastor Knight, she could take over the church, and she was willing to do anything to make that happen. Lopez nodded solemnly. And if she couldn't take over, then she would destroy everything he worked for. Turner knew they were getting closer, but there was still one final piece to the puzzle. Vanessa's decision to kill Pastor Knight might have been driven by a sense of desperation and fear, but it was also a strategic move, one that would require further examination. They had the motive, the access, and the method. Now they just needed to find the final piece of evidence that would prove Vanessa's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. It wouldn't be long before they would have their answer. But for now, Turner's gut told him they were on the verge of uncovering something that would change everything about this case. Detective Turner leaned back in his chair, staring at the stack of files that lay in front of him. His mind was still spinning from everything that had come together in the last few days. Pastor Knight's murder had begun as an emotional outburst, a crime of passion. But the more Turner dug into Vanessa's past, the more he realized this case was far from simple. The facts were mounting, and it was becoming clear that this wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a carefully orchestrated plan. The question now was, why? The police had already picked up Vanessa for questioning. She was the obvious suspect, and the evidence against her seemed insurmountable. But Turner had been a detective for long enough to know that things weren't always what they appeared to be. People had the ability to manipulate situations, hide their true intentions, and twist the truth until it was unrecognizable. That was why he wasn't ready to jump to conclusions yet. "We're missing something," Turner muttered to himself, flipping through the case notes. "There has to be more to this story." Lopez entered the room, interrupting his thoughts. Her face was drawn with frustration, but her eyes were sharp. "Turner, you need to see this." She handed him a set of photographs, crime scene images taken after the shooting. There was the body of Pastor Knight, still sprawled across the altar, his face frozen in a grimace of shock and pain. But what caught Turner's attention were the close-up shots of his hand. It was open, his fingers splayed wide, as though he had been reaching for something before he was struck down. Turner examined the images closely. One of the photos showed Pastor Knight's hand clutching a small object. It was a crumpled note, something he hadn't noticed before. Turner's pulse quickened. "What do you think it is?" Lopez asked, noticing the change in his demeanor. "I don't know," Turner replied, "but it's definitely important. We need to get this note analyzed immediately." As Lopez arranged for the note to be examined, Turner continued to go through the other crime scene photos. Something was bothering him, something about the way Vanessa had acted in the days leading up to the murder. The more he thought about it, the more Turner realized that the entire sequence of events seemed almost too neat. Vanessa was the obvious suspect, but was she the real killer? Hours later, Turner received a call from the lab. The note had been retrieved from Pastor Knight's hand, and its contents were enough to send a chill down his spine. The note contained a single cryptic message. "I know what you did. You won't get away with it." Turner felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The note wasn't written by Vanessa. It wasn't her handwriting. The message was a warning, a threat. But to whom? "I've been digging into Pastor Knight's past," Lopez said, entering the room with a somber look. "I think we've overlooked something crucial." Turner turned to face her, intrigued. "What did you find?" Lopez took a deep breath. It seems that Pastor Knight was involved in something much darker than we realized. There are rumors about illegal activities, corruption, even money laundering, tied to his connections with local businessmen. Turner was taken aback. Are you saying that Pastor Knight wasn't as squeaky clean as he appeared? Lopez nodded. Exactly. He had ties with people who operated in the shadows, people who would do anything to protect their secrets. The thought rattled Turner. Pastor Knight had been a man of faith, a revered figure in the community. The idea that he might have been involved in criminal activities was difficult to reconcile with the image everyone had of him. But if the note was any indication, there was more to his death than Vanessa's jealousy and betrayal. Who else knew about these activities? Turner asked, his mind racing. I'm still working on that, Lopez replied. But there's one person who stands out, a businessman named Daryl Simmons. He's been a donor to the church for years and was one of Pastor Knight's closest associates. Turner felt his gut tighten. Simmons, we need to talk to him. Lopez agreed. I'll set up the interview, but be careful. Simmons is a powerful man. If he's involved in anything illegal, he's not going to talk easily. The next morning, Turner and Lopez made their way to Daryl Simmons' office. Simmons was a tall, imposing man in his mid-40s, dressed in an expensive suit. He exuded confidence, the kind of charisma that only comes with immense wealth and influence. When he greeted the detectives, there was no sign of nervousness, no indication that he might be hiding something. Detectives, he said smoothly, shaking their hands. I understand you have some questions regarding Pastor Knight's tragic passing. I'm sorry to hear about the loss. He was a good man, a true believer. Turner didn't waste time with pleasantries. Mr. Simmons, we've come to ask you about your relationship with Pastor Knight. We know you two were close. Can you tell us about that? Simmons smiled, but it was a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Pastor Knight and I shared a vision. We worked together on many charitable projects, raising funds for the church and other causes. I supported him in his efforts to help the community. Is that all? Turner pressed, his tone growing sharper. Were there any other dealings you had with Pastor Knight? Anything outside of church activities? Simmons hesitated for a moment before responding. Nothing illegal, if that's what you're implying. But yes, there were business ventures, investments, deals to expand the church's outreach. Pastor Knight had big plans, and I supported him as best as I could. Turner wasn't convinced. We've been hearing rumors about money laundering and shady connections tied to your name, Mr. Simmons. How do you respond to that? Simmons' expression darkened. I don't know where you're getting this information, but I'll tell you right now. I've done nothing wrong. Pastor Knight was a man of integrity, and I respected him. But if you're trying to paint me as something I'm not, you'll regret it. Lopez stepped in. We're just trying to find the truth, Mr. Simmons. If you have nothing to hide, then you have nothing to fear. But we do need your cooperation. Simmons glared at the detectives for a moment before his demeanor softened. Look, I didn't know Pastor Knight as well as you think. He had his own plans, his own agenda. If you're looking for dirt, maybe you should be looking at someone else. The meeting ended without any new revelations. But Turner wasn't ready to let Simmons off the hook just yet. His words felt like a diversion, an attempt to steer the conversation away from something deeper. I don't trust him, Turner muttered to Lopez as they left Simmons' office. Lopez agreed. Neither do I, but I don't think he's the one who killed Pastor Knight. Someone's been playing us, and I think we're about to uncover something much bigger than a lover's dispute. Turner's eyes narrowed. He felt the pieces of the puzzle finally beginning to fit together. But there was still one thing he couldn't shake. The note that had been found in Pastor Knight's hand. Someone knew the truth, and that someone was very dangerous. As the detectives prepared to investigate further, one thing was clear. Detective Turner's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts as he returned to his office that afternoon. The more he uncovered, the more complicated this case became. It was no longer about a woman scorned, a jealous lover who shot her pastor boyfriend in a moment of rage. This was something far darker. The cryptic note, Pastor Knight's secret life, and now the ominous involvement of businessman Daryl Simmons. Things were spiraling out of control. There were too many questions with no clear answers. And to make matters worse, Vanessa was still in custody, her story unshaken. She maintained her innocence, claiming she had been in love with the pastor and had no reason to kill him. Yet the evidence mounted against her. Turner was certain Vanessa wasn't the mastermind, but she was at the center of the storm, tangled in a web that, as he suspected, reached far beyond her personal relationship with the pastor. "I can't shake the feeling we're looking in the wrong direction," Turner muttered aloud, running his fingers through his hair as he stared at the wall filled with photographs and case notes. Lopez entered the office, a file folder in her hand. She looked even more determined than usual, and Turner could tell she had made a breakthrough. "Turner, you need to see this." He quickly glanced up and gestured for her to proceed. Lopez placed the folder on his desk and opened it to reveal a set of documents. "Tell me you haven't seen these before," she said. "These are financial records from the church and Pastor Knight's personal accounts. They're suspicious." Turner flipped through the papers, his eyes narrowing as he examined the figures. "Money laundering," he said under his breath. "I knew it." Lopez nodded. "There's a paper trail. Knight was involved in some kind of large-scale money laundering scheme, funneled through the church's charitable donations and investments. But there's one name that keeps coming up: Daryl Simmons." Turner's gut tightened. "Simmons again, yes," Lopez continued. "He was involved in the accounts, but not just as a donor. He was a key player. The church's funds were funneled through a series of offshore accounts, and Simmons is listed as the beneficiary of a majority of them. He had far more influence over Pastor Knight than we realized." "This is bigger than we thought," Turner muttered, processing the information. "The money didn't just disappear. Simmons was using the church as a front to clean his dirty money." Lopez nodded. "That's what it looks like. But here's the thing. The church wasn't the only front. It seems like Simmons had his fingers in other pies as well. Construction deals, real estate investments, and offshore gambling operations. Why do I have the feeling that Vanessa wasn't the only one being manipulated in this mess?" Turner said, half to himself. "We need to dig deeper," Lopez said. "We need to follow the money trail. I think the motive behind Pastor Knight's murder isn't just personal, it's financial. The deeper we go, the more likely it is that someone wanted to silence him before he could reveal something dangerous." Turner slammed his fist on the desk in frustration. And Vanessa was just an easy target, caught in the middle of all this. She was the one who went to the altar that day, shot him, and made it look like a crime of passion. She was being used. "I think you're right," Lopez agreed. "We need to find out what Vanessa knows. We're not just investigating her anymore. We need to talk to her again, but this time with a different approach." The following day, Turner and Lopez sat across from Vanessa in the interrogation room. The look on her face hadn't changed. She was still wearing the same defensive, almost detached expression she had when she was first brought in. "We've been looking into Pastor Knight's finances," Turner began, his tone measured. "We know he was involved in illegal activity. You knew about that, didn't you?" Vanessa's gaze flickered for a moment, but she didn't speak. Turner pressed on. "Daryl Simmons was involved too," he continued. "He had ties to the money laundering scheme that ran through the church. And it looks like you were the one who ended up taking the fall for it all." Vanessa's eyes widened slightly, but she remained silent. Turner could see the internal struggle on her face. She was on the verge of breaking, but she wasn't there yet. "Vanessa," Lopez said, her voice calm yet insistent, "we know you love Pastor Knight, but love can cloud your judgment. When you found out what he was involved in, it wasn't just your heart that was broken, it was your future. Simmons was pulling the strings, and you were stuck in the middle. He's the one who manipulated you." Vanessa looked at Lopez with disbelief, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I didn't know. I didn't know about the money or the things he was involved in. He told me everything would be okay. I didn't want any part of it. I just wanted him back." "Then why the murder, Vanessa?" Turner asked, leaning forward. "Why kill him in front of everyone? If you loved him, why take it that far?" Tears began to well in Vanessa's eyes, and for a moment, she seemed like a broken woman, shattered by guilt, fear, and confusion. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked up at Turner, her voice barely a whisper. "Because he was going to leave me. He told me I had to choose, him or the money. Him or the church. I couldn't lose him. I just couldn't. Lopez gave Turner a subtle nod, urging him to continue. Vanessa, we're not saying you're completely innocent, but you've been used, manipulated. Daryl Simmons wanted you to do his dirty work. He knew you were the perfect pawn in all of this. When Pastor Knight started to pull away from you, you became a liability to him. He wanted to silence him. Vanessa's eyes darted nervously, and she hesitated for a long time before speaking again. I didn't mean to kill him. I was angry, and I just wanted him to stay with me. But I didn't know about all the other stuff. I swear. Turner leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Vanessa's. The pieces were finally falling into place. Vanessa had been manipulated, but she had also made the fateful choice to pull the trigger. The truth about Pastor Knight's death was beginning to unravel in ways that no one could have predicted. Simmons had played his part in orchestrating the entire thing, but there was still more to uncover, more people involved in this deadly game, and Turner was determined to see it all exposed. The investigation wasn't over yet. In fact, it was only just beginning. It had been days since Vanessa's confession. Detective Turner knew he was close, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was still a final, crucial piece of the puzzle left to uncover. The wheels of justice were in motion, but there was something about this case that felt incomplete, like the true motive, the mastermind behind everything, was still lurking in the shadows. Turner spent hours sifting through evidence, speaking to witnesses, and poring over financial documents. He knew that the next step was to bring everything together, because Simmons wasn't working alone, and there were still questions about the full extent of Pastor Knight's involvement in the criminal activities. On a chilly Thursday morning, Turner received a call that changed everything. It was from a local informant, someone who had been close to the pastor in his final months, but had been too afraid to come forward. The informant claimed to know everything about Pastor Knight's dealings with Daryl Simmons and was ready to talk. Turner didn't waste any time. He called Lopez and they rushed to meet the informant in a quiet, out-of-the-way diner on the outskirts of Chicago. The informant was a man in his mid-50s with a nervous twitch in his hands. He looked over his shoulder constantly, as though he was afraid someone might be watching. Turner and Lopez sat across from him, eager for answers. "I know you're not here to waste time," the informant said, his voice shaky. "I know about Simmons and Knight. I know what they were doing." Turner leaned in, trying to keep his tone calm. "What exactly do you know?" The informant swallowed hard before speaking again. Pastor Knight wasn't just involved in money laundering. He was also working with Simmons on a series of real estate scams. They were flipping properties, but not in the legal way. They were using the church's donations to buy up distressed properties and then reselling them at inflated prices. And all the while, they were funneling the profits into offshore accounts. But that wasn't all. They were also involved in illegal gambling operations. They used the church as a cover. Lopez's eyes widened as she absorbed the information. And Vanessa? She wasn't just a lover, the informant continued. She was a front. Simmons needed her to keep the pastor distracted, to keep him from seeing what was really going on. When Knight started pulling away from her, when he realized the extent of the corruption he was involved in, that's when things got dangerous. Vanessa became a liability. Simmons knew he had to get rid of her before she found out too much. Turner's heart pounded. So Vanessa wasn't just the shooter, she was a pawn. But why did she go through with it? The informant hesitated, glancing around nervously before continuing. Because Simmons promised her the life she always wanted. He promised her power, money, and security, but only if she killed Knight. If she didn't do it, Simmons said he would expose everything, including her involvement. Turner sat back, processing the information. It was starting to make sense now. Simmons had played every angle. He had used Vanessa's love for Knight to manipulate her into becoming an unwilling participant in a much larger scheme. And when Knight realized how deep the corruption ran, Simmons knew that the pastor would want to walk away, which would ruin everything. "We have to arrest Simmons," Turner said firmly. "We have enough evidence now to bring him down." Lopez nodded. "And we need to make sure Vanessa gets the help she needs. She's been used as a pawn in a game much bigger than herself." As Turner and Lopez left the diner, they felt the weight of the case on their shoulders. They knew the truth now. The pastor had been the victim of a carefully orchestrated plan to eliminate him before he could expose the full extent of the criminal enterprise. And Vanessa, though guilty of the murder, had been manipulated into taking the fall. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of action. Turner and Lopez worked tirelessly to gather the final pieces of the case. They raided Simmons' properties, finding hidden accounts and documentation that proved his involvement in the money laundering and real estate scams. Simmons was arrested without incident, but the case was far from over. The trial was a media sensation. Vanessa, who had been held in custody awaiting her trial, was offered a plea deal. She agreed to testify against Simmons, and in return, her sentence was significantly reduced. In her testimony, she revealed how she had been manipulated and controlled by Simmons, her once beloved pastor, in the promise of a better life. Vanessa's words brought a sense of clarity and finality to the case. The courtroom was silent as she spoke, and Turner couldn't help but feel a twinge of pity for her. She wasn't a cold-blooded murderer. She was a victim, trapped in a situation that spiraled out of control. In the end, she had made a choice, and that choice led to tragedy. Simmons, on the other hand, was convicted on multiple counts of fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder. He received a lengthy prison sentence, his wealth and power crumbling with the truth. But it wasn't over for Pastor Knight's congregation. The scandal shook the church to its very core. The members, many of whom had trusted and admired Knight, were left reeling. The betrayal was hard to swallow, but the truth had been uncovered. The church worked to rebuild its reputation, but it would never be the same. As for Turner and Lopez, they knew the case had taken a toll on them both. The truth, no matter how much it hurt, had finally come to light. And though justice had been served, the emotional scars of the crime would linger. "I think we've seen the last of Simmons," Lopez said as they wrapped up their investigation. "But I doubt this case will ever leave us." Turner nodded. "I think you're right. There's always another case, always another story. But this one, it's different." As Turner walked out of the office, the weight of the past few weeks lifted from his shoulders. He had uncovered the truth, brought down a criminal mastermind, and helped a woman who had been manipulated into committing an unthinkable act. And while justice had been served, Turner couldn't help but wonder how many more lives had been destroyed by the darkness that lurked behind the facade of power and religion. In the end, the case was solved, but the scars it left would never fade.